Normandy, France, July 1944. The night was still. A low mist rolled across the hedgerows, muffling every sound except the distant hum of engines. German sentries peered into the darkness, gripping their rifles, waiting for movement that never came. Then, a single roar shattered the quiet. A burst of orange light erupted across the field, followed by another. Flames, not from artillery, but from something alive, crawling forward on tracks. A Churchill Crocodile. Its thick armor glistened in the firelight as a stream of liquid flame burst from its nozzle. A torrent so bright it turned night into day. The burning fuel swept through German trenches, across machine gun nests, and into concrete bunkers. Men screamed, others froze, blinded by the sudden light that erased shadow and mercy alike. The smell of burning fuel and scorched earth filled the air. For the soldiers watching, it wasn't a tank anymore. It was a moving inferno, and for the Germans who faced it, one thought tore through every defensive line. Hell had come to Normandy. By the summer of 1944, the war in Europe had entered a brutal, grinding phase. The Allied invasion of Normandy had succeeded, but each mile of advance came at a staggering cost. The Wehrmacht, though weakened, fought with desperate precision. Fortified behind concrete bunkers, hidden machine gun nests, and labyrinths of trenches woven into the countryside. Every advance meant storming a wall of fire. Every hedgerow, every farmstead became a miniature fortress. Conventional tanks, even the reliable Sherman or the heavily armored Churchill, struggled against these static defenses. When infantry tried to flush out German garrisons, they were cut down by machine guns and grenades. Artillery softened targets, but rarely finished them. That was when Allied engineers turned to a weapon with a terrifying legacy: fire. The handheld flamethrower, already used in North Africa and the Pacific, was both feared and hated. Its range was short, its operator exposed, and its effect horrifying. But it worked. It broke morale. It forced surrender. The problem was simple. The man carrying it rarely survived long enough to use it twice. British engineers began to ask a grimly practical question. What if fire could be delivered safely? From a tank? The concept wasn't new. Experiments with mechanized flamethrowers had existed since World War I, but the technology had been crude. Flame tanks of the early 1940s, such as the British Wasp and Ronson, offered glimpses of potential. But their range was limited to a few dozen yards, and their fuel systems were dangerously volatile. The solution would come from a marriage of engineering resilience and battlefield necessity. In 1943, as Allied planners looked ahead to invading Fortress Europe, the British Petroleum Warfare Department, a small, secretive branch of the military research establishment, was tasked with perfecting an armored flamethrower capable of assaulting concrete bunkers and pillboxes head-on. The result was terrifyingly effective: the Churchill Crocodile. Built on the sturdy frame of the Churchill Mark VII tank, it carried a trailer of pressurized fuel, a thick, tar-like mixture of gasoline and napalm components, linked to the turret through an armored pipe. At the pull of a trigger, compressed nitrogen forced the burning liquid through the nozzle, shooting flame over 100 yards, farther than any flamethrower in the world. The weapon turned the slow, lumbering Churchill into something primeval, a metal beast breathing fire. Its first public demonstration in Britain stunned even its own officers. One commander wrote in his report, "The psychological effect is beyond calculation. No man could stand in the open against such a weapon." But this was more than a weapon of shock. It was a tactical answer to a strategic nightmare: how to break the German fortifications that barred the road to victory. Every British and American assault, Commander understood what awaited them beyond the beaches: concrete, wire, and machine guns waiting for the first sign of movement. The Crocodile and later the American Zippo Shermans would become their answer. When Operation Overlord began, few German commanders knew what these modified tanks could do. To them, they looked like any other Churchill or Sherman. It was only when the first burst of flame illuminated the battlefield that they realized, too late, what they were facing. The Allies had brought fire itself to war, and in the weeks after D-Day, the line between conventional combat and raw terror began to blur. By mid-1944, flamethrower tanks had evolved from field experiments into frontline instruments of psychological warfare. Two nations perfected their own versions, the British Churchill Crocodile and the American M4 Sherman Zippo. The Crocodile was the more iconic of the two, a deliberate creation of British engineering pragmatism. Its design was brutal in its simplicity. A heavily armored Churchill Mark VII formed the base. Its hull machine gun was replaced by a flame projector. Behind it, a 6.5-ton armored trailer carried 400 gallons of thickened fuel under pressure. The two were connected by a steel-reinforced pipe, protected by armor plating. When fired, the projector could hurl a stream of flaming fuel up to 120 yards, almost the length of a football field. The flame, mixed with compressed nitrogen, clung to surfaces, pouring through embrasures, trenches, and doorways with horrifying persistence. Anything caught inside, concrete or flesh, burned. The tank could still use its 75mm gun for conventional combat. It wasn't just a flamethrower, it was a dual-purpose weapon, equally capable of burning a bunker or destroying an enemy tank. Across the Atlantic, American engineers followed suit. The U.S. Army had learned from bloody lessons in the Pacific. At Tarawa and Saipan, Japanese fortifications made traditional assaults suicidal. So the Marines modified their own tanks. Shermans fitted with Navy-designed flamethrower systems. The nickname Zippo came naturally, borrowed from the famous lighter brand. Unlike the Crocodile's towed trailer, the American system integrated its fuel tanks directly inside the hull. The range was shorter, around 60-80 yards, but in the close, suffocating jungles of the Pacific, that was enough. Both designs embodied a grim truth of total war. When faced with a fortified enemy unwilling to surrender, the Allies turned to terror as a tool of efficiency. By June 1944, special armored regiments had been trained to use these tanks in coordination with infantry. British 79th Armoured Division, under Major General Percy Hobart, became the spearhead of this new form of warfare. His unit, known as Hobart's Funnies, fielded an entire arsenal of experimental tanks designed to overcome obstacles, bridge layers, mine flails, amphibious vehicles, and the Crocodile among them. Hobart's philosophy was simple. There was no such thing as an impossible objective, only a lack of proper machinery. The Germans, in contrast, had little comparable technology by that stage of the war. While early in the conflict they had experimented with Flampanzers, those machines were vulnerable and short-ranged. By 1944, the Reich's resources were stretched thin. The panzer divisions were fighting defensive wars, relying on static defenses rather than offensive innovation. And so, when the Crocodiles and Zippos appeared on the battlefield, many German soldiers were unprepared for what they saw. Reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division described the first encounters with British flamethrower tanks near Caen. The enemy's tank emitted a stream of fire, lighting up the night sky. The men in the forward position broke. No one could remain in the trench. In those moments, the Allies discovered that the flamethrower's greatest strength wasn't just in destruction. It was in fear. Units would surrender rather than face immolation. Machine gun nests went silent after a single burst of flame. For commanders, that meant fewer losses, faster breakthroughs, and a demoralized enemy. For the soldiers using them, it meant carrying the burden of a weapon. that left nothing but smoke and ash behind. Flamethrower. Tanks were not just machines, they were instruments of psychological dominance, and as the Allied forces pushed deeper into occupied France, the battlefield would soon become a stage for their most terrifying performance yet. The nights would grow brighter and shorter. Because when the flame tanks advanced, darkness no longer offered protection. The firestorm that swept through Europe in 1944 was not just a triumph of engineering. It was a convergence of fear, ingenuity, and necessity. To understand why the flamethrower tanks became such a decisive weapon, one must view them through several lenses: human, technological, and tactical. Each reveals a different layer of the same inferno. For the men inside a flamethrower tank, war felt different. The crew of a Crocodile or Sherman Zippo carried more than just ammunition. They carried fire itself. The fuel tank, pressurized and volatile, was both weapon and death trap. A single shell could ignite it, turning the entire vehicle into a moving funeral pyre. The crews knew this. Every time they advanced toward a fortified position, they felt the risk as a physical weight. Inside the confined steel hull, the roar of the engine and the hiss of pressurized fuel became their constant companions. The air smelled of gasoline and hot metal. Many soldiers confessed that the psychological strain was unbearable. They were feared by their own comrades, revered for their courage, yet often isolated. Infantrymen followed their fire with awe and pity. One British tanker later recalled, "We were both angels and demons. They cheered when we burned out a bunker, then went quiet when they saw what was left." What was left was seldom human. The weapon left charred silhouettes, melted equipment, and an odor that no one forgot. And yet, despite the horror, these men climbed into their tanks again and again, because every yard gained meant fewer friends dying in the mud ahead. The science behind these tanks was grimly elegant. At the heart of every Crocodile was a system designed to weaponize pressure and chemistry. A nitrogen cylinder forced fuel from the trailer through a flexible armored pipe to the turret-mounted projector. The ignition system, often a simple spark plug or magnesium cartridge, turned the fuel jet into a continuous flame reaching over 100 yards. The burning mixture wasn't simple gasoline. It was thickened using latex compounds, producing a sticky, gel-like fire that clung to everything it touched. This was an early form of napalm, long before the word became infamous. Its purpose was not only destruction, but persistence. The flame didn't just burn, it stayed. In bunkers, it consumed oxygen, suffocating those inside even if the fire didn't reach them. Against armor, it found seams, melting cables, and blistering paint until the tank crew within could no longer function. The Germans quickly learned to fear that distinctive hiss before the blast. Even Panzer Grenadiers, trained to face armor with courage, would break ranks when confronted by a jet of living fire. But the Crocodile was more than terror. It was a masterclass in Allied adaptation, a perfect example of turning battlefield problems into mechanical solutions. Every part of it, from the pressure valves to the armored fuel trailer, was a testament to wartime innovation driven by necessity. Tactically, the flamethrower tank was not a solo predator. It was a team weapon. Infantry advanced in coordination with it, using the flames to flush out hidden defenders. Crocodiles would roll up to pillboxes, unleash a short burst, and then wait. Often the enemy emerged waving white flags, desperate to escape the heat. During the fighting around Caen in July 1944, the 141st Regiment of the Royal Armoured Corps used crocodiles to clear entire German positions that artillery had failed to neutralize. In one operation, a single flame burst caused 300 German soldiers to surrender. The key was psychological. A man might endure shell fire, machine guns, even tanks, but fire was different. Fire erased the illusion of control. The moment soldiers saw it coming toward them, instinct replaced discipline. In the Pacific, the American Shermans used the same principle against Japanese defenders dug into caves and tunnels. A few seconds of flame could reach where bullets and grenades could not. The moral weight was heavy, but commanders called it merciful efficiency. Every flame burst that forced surrender saved dozens of Allied lives. The Allies had found a weapon that could both destroy and compel, one that fought, not just the enemy's body, but his mind. Each burst of flame on those battlefields carried layers of fear, engineering and tactical logic woven together. To those who witnessed it, it seemed that humanity itself had built a creature made of steel and fire, something that defied nature, yet served it. But the story of the flamethrower tank is incomplete without the eyes of those who faced it, the enemy who watched darkness erupt into living flame. For the German infantry, the appearance of flamethrower tanks on the Western Front was nothing short of apocalyptic. They had faced tanks before. The thunder of treads, the crack of shells, the shriek of ricochets, they were trained for those, but nothing prepared them for the roar of a machine that breathed fire. The first reports filtered through Wehrmacht field communications in Normandy and the Low Countries. Feuerpanzer, spraying flame over great distance. Bunkers, no defense. To many, it felt like the battlefield itself had turned against them. German soldiers who survived Crocodile attacks spoke of the overwhelming sensory assault, the brightness of the flame, the heat, and the choking stench of burning fuel. Those in fortified positions often died without a single bullet fired as flames sucked the oxygen from their shelters. Even hardened veterans, men who had fought in Russia and Africa, found themselves paralyzed. The psychological shock rippled through entire units. Machine gunners abandoned their posts, grenadiers fled trenches, and commanders struggled to maintain cohesion. German tactical bulletins began issuing warnings. Do not allow these tanks to close range. Destroy with Panzerfausts before they fire. But that was easier said than done. Once a Crocodile opened fire, few had the nerve to stand their ground. The flamethrower tanks became more than a physical weapon. They became a myth, whispered among exhausted soldiers at night. The belief spread that capture by a Crocodile crew meant a fiery death. In reality, most crews followed strict orders to accept surrender. But in the chaos of battle, perception outweighed truth. To the Germans, the Crocodile was not just a tank. It was the embodiment of Allied vengeance, the Peibieder retribution of all the cities bombed, and all the lives lost, and perhaps that fear was the weapon's greatest strength behind. Every burst of flame was strategy, cold, calculated, and methodical. The Allied High Command, led by figures such as Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery and General Omar Bradley, understood that success in Europe would depend on clearing fortifications faster than the Germans could regroup. The flamethrower tank fit perfectly into this logic of relentless momentum. British General Percy Hobart, architect of the Hobart's Funnies, ensured that the Crocodiles were always part of mixed formations, combined arms units that could tackle every kind of obstacle. In his view, war was an engineering problem, and every problem demanded a mechanical solution. When planning the assaults on Caen, the Siegfried Line, and later the Rhine crossings, commanders integrated Crocodiles as shock weapons. They led the way in the first few minutes of an assault, softening the enemy's morale before infantry closed in. The Americans, too, adapted. In the Pacific, commanders like General Holland Smith and Admiral Chester Nimitz saw the value of the Sherman Zippo in amphibious operations. On Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Zippos worked in teams, one tank firing while others covered it, slowly clearing fortified Japanese tunnels. Leadership recognized a fundamental truth. These tanks were not just tools of destruction, but instruments of persuasion. They shortened battles by breaking willpower, They saved lives by replacing weeks of attrition with moments of fire. Yet every commander who employed them knew the cost. In humanity, in perception, and in the moral scars that would follow. Fire had always carried symbolic weight in war. Purification, punishment, and terror intertwined. But the use of mechanized flame raised questions even among those who wielded it. Was it necessary? Was it just? Many soldiers viewed it as a last resort, an evil used to prevent greater loss. Others saw it as a step too far, a descent into medieval cruelty in a war already defined by industrial death. Photographs from Normandy, the Rhineland, and the Pacific show soldiers staring at the aftermath. Blackened bunkers, scorched weapons, silence where once there had been resistance. There was no triumph in their faces, only fatigue. War correspondent accounts often avoided describing flamethrower actions in detail. The horror was simply too graphic for the public to read. Even official reports used restrained language. The effect was satisfactory. Yet, on the battlefield, satisfaction had a smell. Burning oil, smoke, and silence. For those who commanded, there was no time for moral hesitation. The war demanded results, and results were measured in survival. Still, the memory lingered long after victory. Many veterans later spoke of nightmares, of fire that would not die even after they closed their eyes. The weapon had done its job, but it had left a scar, not just on the earth it scorched, but on the souls of the men who used it. By late 1944, the Crocodiles and Zippos had proven their worth. Tactically unstoppable, psychologically devastating. But their true test still lay ahead, in the dark, fortified ruins of Western Europe, where every village became a battlefield, and every night a contest between light and shadow. The stage was set for their defining moment, when fire turned the tide of battle. The British offensive to capture the city of Caen had bogged down into brutal house-to-house fighting. The Germans, elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, and the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, held fast among rubble, dugouts, and concrete defenses. Every street corner was a fortress, every ruined church a machine gun nest. For weeks, artillery and bombers had failed to dislodge them. The city burned, yet the defenders still fired back. Then, from the smoke, came the unmistakable silhouette of the Churchill Crocodile, to the infantry following behind. The tank seemed alive, a lumbering beast cloaked in soot, its metal sides blackened by smoke and dust. It moved deliberately, unhurried toward the German positions. When the first jet of flame burst from its nozzle, the entire block glowed orange. Witnesses said the light reached the rooftops. One officer recorded, "It was like dawn breaking over hell." The enemy stopped shooting almost instantly. The Crocodiles advanced methodically, 2 at a time, supported by infantry from the 7th Battalion, Royal Regiment of Scotland. They fired short bursts, each one clearing a bunker, a basement, a trench. In less than an hour, resistance on the northern outskirts of Caen collapsed. Entire platoons of German defenders surrendered without a fight. They emerged coughing, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes wide in disbelief. No one wanted to face another blast. Further south, in Operation Goodwood, the Crocodiles moved with the armored spearhead toward the Bourguebus Ridge. There, the Germans fought fiercely. Panthers and anti-tank guns waiting in ambush. Even here, the flame tanks had their role. When infantry pinned down an enemy trench too deep for shells to reach, a Crocodile rolled forward, its heavy armor shrugging off machine gun fire. One 5-second burst, a river of burning gel, silenced it forever. The effect went beyond destruction. German morale in those sectors shattered. Reports to Obergruppenführer Kurt Meyer, commander of the 12th SS, described troops refusing to man positions where Crocodiles were reported active. The myth of the Feuerpanzer had become reality. As the Allied armies pushed through Normandy's bocage, the thick, hedgerow-covered countryside, the crocodiles proved their worth again and again. Conventional tanks were vulnerable in the narrow lanes, where every turn concealed an ambush. But the flame tank was different. It didn't need to see its target clearly. It only needed to reach it. In Operation Bluecoat, west of Caen, the 79th Armored Division used crocodiles to clear entire villages with minimal infantry losses. Each assault followed the same rhythm. Artillery bombardment, then the approach of crocodiles under covering smoke, then the eruption of flame. A sudden, roaring blaze that swept through trenches and basements. What artillery and gunfire could not achieve, the fire did. German strongpoints that had resisted for days fell in minutes. And yet, for the men inside the tanks, victory came at a psychological cost. Each time they fired, they saw the results up close. Each burst of flame revealed the full, terrible clarity of war's reality. Bodies, shadows, silence. Still, they pushed forward, because every trench they cleared meant one less ambush for the infantry behind them. The crocodile's reputation spread quickly across the front. In towns like Evrecy, Le Havre, and Saint-Pierre-sur-Dive, local civilians whispered about the fire-breathing tanks that drove out the Germans. To Allied troops, they were both saviors and specters. The machines that could end a stalemate, but left behind nothing living. By the time the Normandy campaign drew to a close, over 250 crocodiles had been deployed in the field. Their success led to their continued use throughout France and into the Low Countries. They were now more than specialized engineering tanks. They were psychological weapons of the highest order. In the German diaries, recovered after the campaign, one entry from a soldier of the 21st Panzer Division captured the essence of this new terror. We heard them before we saw them. The heavy engines, then the hiss. The air turned red. Men screamed for God. I ran without thinking. For that soldier, the night truly turned to day. And never again would the darkness feel safe. But the crocodile's greatest test, and its most infamous legacy, would come later. Not in the fields of Normandy, but in the final months of the war, as the Allies closed in on Germany itself. There, the fire would meet concrete, and fear would meet desperation. Snow covered the hills of western Germany, but the fortifications beneath the white blanket were anything but peaceful. Rows of dragon's teeth, steel-reinforced bunkers, and minefields marked the western wall. The Siegfried Line, Germany's last major defensive barrier before the Rhine. For months, Allied infantry and armor had battered themselves against it, advancing yard by yard through biting cold and fierce resistance. Machine guns echoed through the forests. Mortars thumped from pillboxes buried deep into the ground. Each advance felt like a siege. But this time, the Allies brought something new. From the smoke of shattered pines came the deep rumble of Churchill crocodiles. The long winter had not slowed them. Their armored trailers, 400 gallons of thickened fuel, glistened with frost. The men of the 79th Armored Division called them hell wagons. To the Germans inside the bunkers, they were worse than that. They were omens. At the village of Cleve, near the northern tip of the Siegfried Line, the British 79th and Canadian 1st Armoured Brigades prepared a combined assault. The plan was simple and brutal. Crocodiles and AVRs would breach the concrete defenses while infantry moved in behind them. At dawn, under a low gray sky, the tanks advanced. The Germans opened up immediately. Machine guns, Panzerfausts, and 80mm fire from concealed guns. The crocodiles kept moving, their heavy armor shrugging off hits that would have crippled lighter vehicles. When the first tank reached effective range, its gunner fired a 3-second burst. A sheet of fire roared across the frozen trench line. The snow turned black. Ice melted instantly. The front of the bunker seemed to breathe flame. And within seconds, its defenders stumbled out, hands raised, faces pale with terror. The infantry followed, sweeping through the ruins without a single casualty. In less than an hour, 5 bunkers that had resisted for days were silenced. By nightfall, Cleva was in Allied hands. The effect was the same all along the line. German commanders radioed frantic reports of flame tanks appearing in multiple sectors. Rumors spread faster than facts. Men claimed the Crocodiles could burn through concrete, that their fuel trailers exploded on impact, that they never ran out of fire. None of it was true, but none of it mattered. The psychological damage was done. Further south, in Operation Veritable, Crocodiles again led the charge through flooded terrain and dense forest. The enemy bunkers, built to withstand shells, offered no refuge against fire. At Goch, Canadian troops watched as the flame tanks cleared an entire ridge in minutes. Captain John Archer of the Calgary Highlanders later wrote, "When the Crocodiles opened up, the enemy ceased to exist as a fighting force. They ran, those who could, and those who didn't were simply gone." It was the only time I ever saw SS troops abandon a position without orders. Each operation confirmed the same truth. In the final months of the war, Allied firepower was overwhelming, but fear, raw, consuming fear, was the weapon that broke German resolve. The Crocodiles advanced through Reichswald Forest, Wiese, and Kevelaer, their trails marked by burned-out bunkers and white flags fluttering from slit windows. In one engagement near Xanten, a single Crocodile forced the surrender of 300 German soldiers entrenched across a wide ditch. The tank's commander fired 2 bursts of flame across the open ground, never even hitting the position directly. That was enough. By March 1945, as Allied armies approached the Rhine, the Germans knew what awaited them beyond the river. The fire-breathing tanks had become symbols of the unstoppable. In the ruins of Remagen, Cologne, and Essen, the Crocodiles followed infantry through the cities, burning out sniper nests and fortified basements. Civilians, terrified by the glow, huddled in shelters, praying the tanks would pass them by. For the German defenders, there was no more illusion of victory. What had begun years earlier with blitzkrieg and confidence now ended in smoke and surrender. The flame tanks, once considered experimental, even impractical, had become emblems of Allied dominance. Where artillery softened, the Crocodiles cleansed. And yet, even among Allied soldiers, a quiet unease lingered. They had seen what the weapon could do, to men, to structures, to the very landscape. The power that had terrified the enemy also haunted its users. As one British sapper put it simply, "When you've seen what fire does, you never really forget." The Crocodiles would cross the Rhine soon after, heading toward northern Germany. But for most German soldiers, the war was already lost, not just on the battlefield, but in the mind, because when night turned to fire, courage turned to ash. When the flames finally died down, Europe was a continent of shadows. The war that had begun with the roar of blitzkrieg ended in a haze of smoke, rubble, and silence. The Allied advance across the Rhine in March 1945 marked the collapse of the Third Reich's western defenses. The Churchill Crocodiles, alongside their American counterparts, the M4A3R3 Zippo Shermans, were instrumental in clearing the path to victory. Every mile gained had been a battle through fire and fear. In city after city, Allied commanders noted the same pattern. Where Crocodiles were deployed, resistance broke faster, surrenders increased, and casualties, on both sides, were markedly reduced. Even the most fortified positions, designed to hold out for weeks, fell in hours once the flame tanks arrived. At Wiesel, Ries, and Xanten, flame units supported the final push toward the Ruhr Pocket, the industrial heart of Nazi Germany. By April, the Rhine crossings were secure. Within 2 weeks, the once proud Wehrmacht along the Western Front was in full retreat or surrender. But the cost and the imagery of those victories lingered, far longer than the smoke, reports from combat engineers described the aftermath of flame. Assaults in grim detail. Bunkers charred black inside, rifles melted into the floor, walls covered in soot and silence. The smell of burned oil and stone clung to everything. For the Allied troops who advanced through these positions, the experience was sobering. They understood that the Crocodiles had saved lives, their lives, by forcing enemy capitulation. Yet they also saw what that meant. Fire was not selective. It consumed everything it touched. In one official British Army report following the battle for Gauche, the assessment read, "The flame projector proved decisive in overcoming resistance, particularly in concrete emplacements. However, the weapon's psychological and moral effect was profound, far exceeding its physical damage." The same observation appeared in American after-action notes from Okinawa and Iwo Jima, where the U.S. Marines used flamethrower Shermans against entrenched Japanese defenders. The principle was identical: steel, pressure, and flame to root out positions no grenade or rifle could reach. Across both Europe and the Pacific, a new understanding of warfare had emerged. Technology alone didn't win battles. The terror it inspired often did. In the weeks following Germany's collapse, Allied high commands reviewed the strategic use of flame weapons. While their effectiveness in close combat was undeniable, so too were the ethical questions they raised. The British War Office recorded debates about whether flamethrowers should remain part of post-war doctrine. Many argued they were indispensable for bunker warfare. Others insisted they belonged to a darker, primitive age of combat. Even Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who had endorsed their use during Normandy, later admitted their psychological weight was difficult to reconcile. "They were necessary," he wrote, "but it was a terrible necessity." Captured German officers expressed their own horror at facing flame tanks. Interrogation reports from early 1945 contain repeated references to Feuerpanzer, tanks of fire. Many units refused to hold ground against them, describing the experience as hopeless and inhuman. In one account from the 84th Infantry Division, a German sergeant confessed, "When we saw the flames come, we stopped being soldiers. We only thought of escape." The Allies had found a weapon that not only destroyed fortifications, it broke the will to fight. But as Europe lay in ruins, the victors also knew this weapon could never be used lightly again. The Crocodiles had helped end the war, but they had also revealed its darkest truth, that sometimes victory comes not from superior strength, but from the fear of what man can unleash. By May 1945, the flame tanks of the 79th Armored Division stood silent. The trailers were drained, the hoses coiled, the turrets quiet. What had once been roaring engines of destruction now sat idle among the ruins of northern Germany. The war in Europe was over, but for those who had commanded and crewed the Crocodiles, the memories remained as vivid as the light they had cast on the battlefield. In the days following the German surrender, Allied engineers toured the former front lines to assess damage. What they found confirmed what the troops already knew. The Crocodiles had been among the most feared and effective ground weapons of the entire campaign. Entire sections of the Siegfried Line had collapsed not from bombardment, but from panic. Documents recovered from German positions showed that units were instructed to withdraw immediately if Feuerpanzer were reported nearby. In the psychological war of attrition that defined the final phase of World War II, that fear was as decisive as any artillery barrage. For the British and Canadian divisions that fielded the Crocodiles, their combat record was extraordinary. In Normandy, they had been crucial in breaching fortified villages like Caen, Bourget-Bousse Ridge, and Villers-Bocage. In the Netherlands, they cleared pillboxes along the Scheldt estuary, ensuring vital supply routes. In Germany, they led the final drive through the Reichswald and across the Rhine. By the time the war ended, fewer than 800 crocodiles had been produced. Yet their impact far outweighed their number. They represented less than 1% of the Allied armored force, but were referenced in over 30% of German field reports from the Western Front between 1944 and 1945. That disproportion told a story not of quantity, but of terror. In one report from the Wehrmacht's 7th Army, a colonel summarized it bluntly. Where the flame tanks attack, morale ceases to exist. The crocodile's reach extended far beyond Europe. The Americans adopted the principle with their M4A3R3 Sherman Zippos, which proved devastating in the Pacific campaigns. On islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where Japanese defenders fought to the last man, the use of armored flamethrowers often decided the outcome. For the Japanese, who had built their defense strategy around caves and tunnels, these flame tanks were the ultimate nightmare. The fire crawled through every opening, denying even the illusion of safety. When peace returned, the crocodile became an uneasy relic. It had done its job. Too well, some thought. Few nations wanted to celebrate a weapon that evoked such horror. By the early 1950s, most crocodiles were retired from active service. Some remained in use for training. Others were sold to allied nations or scrapped for parts. A handful survived in museums, their flamethrower assemblies removed or rendered inert. Visitors would stare at the armored shells, never quite grasping the terror they once carried inside. Yet for military historians and engineers, the crocodile marked an important evolution, the realization that psychological warfare could be mechanized. It wasn't just about firepower or armor thickness. It was about controlling what the enemy felt. And on that front, no tank in history had matched it. Decades later, veterans of both sides would meet, sometimes in quiet remembrance ceremonies. Old British crews, gray-haired and soft-spoken, would recall their machines with mixed pride and discomfort. Former German soldiers would admit that nothing on the battlefield, not artillery, not air raids, compared to the terror of seeing a tank spewing fire. One former crocodile gunner put it best in an interview with the Imperial War Museum. We didn't feel brave. We felt like we were holding something that didn't belong in this world. The last operational crocodiles were finally decommissioned in the late 1950s. Their legacy, however, burned on, not in glory, but in memory. They symbolized the extremes of human ingenuity and the terrible cost of victory. By turning night into fire, they had illuminated more than just the battlefield. They had shown the world what war truly looked like when the light refused to fade. In the quiet decades after 1945, the flame tanks of World War II became more than tools of war. They became symbols of humanity's ability to innovate and to destroy. The crocodiles in Europe, the Sherman Zippos in the Pacific. They were engineered with precision, operated with skill, and feared with certainty. They exemplified a terrifying truth, that industrial might, combined with human ingenuity, could turn fear itself into a weapon. For the soldiers who crewed them, the experience was paradoxical. Inside the steel hull, they were protected from bullets and shrapnel, yet acutely aware of the deadly fuel trailing behind them. Every ignition carried both power and responsibility. They saved lives by preventing infantry from storming fortified positions, yet each burst of flame left permanent marks on both the enemy and the human conscience. For those on the receiving end, the flamethrower tanks represented an absolute confrontation with mortality. The jungles of Burma, the islands of the Pacific, and the fortified villages of Normandy were rendered unrecognizable. Bunkers were razed, tunnels turned to ash, and entire defensive lines collapsed under terror as much as fire. In these moments, courage met inevitability, and fire wrote the final word. Yet the legacy of these machines is not measured in tactical victories alone. They transformed how armies approached both technology and psychology in combat. Commanders learned that battlefield dominance was as much about controlling perception as it was about guns and shells. The flamethrower tank became a lesson in the duality of war. Innovation as salvation, innovation as horror. History remembers them quietly, often in gray archival photographs and grainy film footage. The roar of the engine, the hiss of the flame, the blackened earth left behind, all speak of a war where victory demanded extremes. They remind us that even as nations pursue efficiency and precision, the cost is invariably human. And so, the crocodiles and Zippos remain etched in memory, neither celebrated nor forgotten. They were instruments of necessity, of fear, of survival. In their fire, we see both the brilliance and the burden of human ingenuity. War has always been a teacher, harsh and unrelenting, and the flamethrower tank was one of its most unforgettable lessons.